Okay, I'll get the screen sharing started as well. So my name is Mike Ewall. I'm an attorney, and that's not the main hat I wear. I'm an environmental justice advocate and activist who got involved when they first tried to build a trash incinerator near my hometown over 30 years ago. And around 1990, 91 is when I first got involved. And ever since, I've been helping folks across Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and then across the entire country, forming ultimately Energy Justice Network as a network to help communities like yours fight against dirty energy and waste industry facilities and stop proposals for them. And I've also been very involved in more recent years, since we've stopped so many proposals. There aren't as many these days. We're working now on shutting down existing facilities that don't need to exist, that are doing inappropriate things like burning waste. Bristol Residents for Clean Air is a group that I helped Jody form a handful of years ago when we first learned about this proposal for medical waste incineration in Bristol. And I've been working with similar groups across the country on various types of things, including specifically this very same issue. So if you can monitor the chat, let me know if there's something I can see from there. Just interrupt me if it's something I should respond to. Okay, so I'm just going to start moving into the presentation here so we can keep things moving. I know at the library I have to be out of there at 8, so I will try to keep this as short as I can so we can leave as much room for Q&A. So for those looking for more information about waste incineration in general, there are a lot of fact sheets and reports and other useful links and resources on our website, energyjustice.net/incineration. So feel free to check that out. And we also have a mapping site at ejmap.org where you can find certain industries. This was the map of trash incinerators in North America. And we have all sorts of other energy and waste facilities mapped here. And so this is the most recent. I just updated this today. And there are some that closed down earlier this year that are thankfully no longer on the map. Zooming into Connecticut, you'll see that there are 4 trash incinerators remaining after the one in Hartford, which is one of the 2 bigger ones, closed a few summers ago. And one of the things that relates to why we're seeing what we're seeing here now is that Covanta is looking to make their old small incinerators economically viable, or they're selling them off. If you look at their 10 smallest incinerators in recent years, 4 of them, they either backed out of owning them or closed them down. And all 3 of theirs that currently burn medical waste are among their 10 smallest. And Bristol would be the 4th among their 10 smallest. So this is a survival strategy for them to burn more lucrative waste streams. Now, if we look at this whole industry, we see it's one that's crashing. There are 52 trash incinerators that closed since year 2000. The latest was just about a month ago. And their average age when they closed was just 24 years old. So this one is already past its prime. And very few make it past their 40th birthday. One of the ones that did just burned down last year in Florida, but there are very few places actually building new ones. So the survival strategy is to take these existing ones, especially the smaller ones, and pump as much money out of them as possible, which is where medical waste burning comes in. This is just the trend line for how many operating commercial trash incinerators there are in the U.S. This is a line that's been crashing continuously over the past couple of decades. And the last more general slide I'll share is this is an analysis of the largest incinerator for any kind of waste in the U.S., which is the Covanta trash incinerator not far from me in Chester, Pennsylvania. I live in Philadelphia, and we're surrounded by 5 incinerators, but the largest one is this one. And the county did a study, and it is still waiting to come out in final form, but it's already been drafted, and there's a life cycle assessment that's part of it that is finalized. This is the result of that life cycle analysis, and they look at incineration versus landfilling. Now this here, the smaller bar, this is the landfill where the ash already goes from the incinerator that burns the waste from that county and Philadelphia, New York, and other places. And you can see that the environmental and health costs are far greater to incinerate than to go straight to a landfill. The blue is the climate impacts, which are worse when you burn everything and put that carbon immediately into the atmosphere. The brown represents the heart attacks and strokes from particulate matter that's released from the incinerator. The red represents birth defects and cancers from toxic chemicals that are largely coming out of the incinerator, a lot more than you get out of a landfill with those thin bars at the top here. And the yellow is the asthma attacks that come from the nitrogen oxides that form smog at ground level and make it harder for people to breathe. All of these added up show that burning trash is far more dangerous than going straight to a landfill. And yet in Connecticut, you have public officials who believe the opposite, who keep pushing harder and harder to maintain existing incinerators and to even build new ones. They're even now talking about reopening one in Hartford. So on medical waste specifically, Covanta wants to build what is essentially not a new facility. It's their existing trash incinerator in Bristol, but they want to build in the ability to take medical waste and feed it into their existing trash incinerator, displacing some of the industrial waste that they currently already burn. This is just a cover slide for the Bristol Residents for Clean Air. If you have not liked them on Facebook, please look them up and give them a like on there so you can follow along. Now, the Covanta Bristol facility is, like I said, one of the smaller ones in the country. It's only 650 tons per day that they burn, which may sound like a lot, but they go up to about 3,500 tons per day, the biggest one near me. And it started off in 1988. So this is one of the older ones in the country. And Covanta is the largest operator of trash incinerators in the US. They own or operate 34 of the 65 that are remaining in the country, including all 3 that already burn medical waste. Now, we first learned about this attempt to burn medical waste in Bristol about 4 years ago, a couple years after they were already talking to your public officials in Bristol. They had a meeting with the Board of Water Commissioners. They got thumbs up from the mayor. And these are just some of the documents that we found that are on the city government's website, or at least they used to be. And it had a whole presentation there from Covanta. You can see it was 2018 when that started. The mayor at the time was basically endorsing it, and later endorsed it with 2 very specific letters that are in the company's permit application. And then this is part of the PowerPoint that they presented there. Now, residents didn't find out about this until about 3 years later, but your public officials were well aware of it because they were getting these presentations. And you can see in here, they talk about must incinerate components of the medical waste stream. They outright lied to us, and the us in this case is a number of different environmental groups that I was working with across the state of Connecticut who met with Covanta, and they told us specifically that every state except for a handful requires that medical waste be incinerated, and we'll come back to that in a minute. That turned out not to be true at all. But they're acting as if there's a good portion of the waste stream that the medical waste stream that needs to be burned, and these are the things that they're saying they will or will not burn. They previously were burning at their Oregon facility fetal tissue, and there was a big uproar over that. So they learned from that mistake, and they're saying we're not going to burn that stuff anymore. And we're not going to burn body parts in bulk. That's what pathological waste is. But we'll take some. You know, the smaller amounts are okay, but like small pathological waste. But bulk amounts, same thing for chemotherapy waste. Trace amounts they'll take, but bulk amounts they won't. That's basically what they're saying here. And these are just some of the things mentioning their approvals, including support from the city of Bristol. Now, the things that they want to burn, this is straight out of their permit application. You can see this list here. So it does include some things that might be a little bit unsavory. Again, pathological material means body parts, chemotherapy waste, or hazardous chemicals used in cancer treatments. And there are a lot of other types of waste in here, including a lot of this being PVC plastic, which is especially dangerous to burn because it makes the most toxic chemicals known to science, which are dioxins, which we'll get into in a minute. Now, this is the cover page of the permit application. Is a very long one, so I'm not trying to share the whole thing on PowerPoint, but you can see and you can look up. It's a very extensive documentation of what they want to do. And what they want to do is something that's not necessary. We found, based on EPA documents, that there used to be 6,200 medical waste incinerators in the U.S. in 1988. And in the most recent EPA inventory of them, there are only 33. And I've documented that several of those have closed. So we're looking at somewhere between 15 and 30 medical waste incinerators still operating in the US. The numbers have completely crashed. And that's because the industry has moved to safe non-burn alternatives like autoclaving for the most part, instead of having to burn medical waste, which is totally unnecessary. Now, if they get away with burning medical waste, they will be the only facility doing that north or east of Pennsylvania. New York does not have any medical waste incinerators anymore, neither does anywhere in New England. And they would be basically importing from many states around. They've already said this. They haven't said exactly which states or how far, and they can't know that necessarily or won't commit to a geography. But it's clear from looking at the other facilities around the country that there'll be either the third or fourth largest medical waste incinerator in the US if they get to burn at the capacity that they're seeking. Now, we went through all the different types of things that are considered medical waste in one form or another and found that there are safer alternatives for every single one of them. Most of that medical waste is what you call red bag waste. You see it put in literally red bags. And that's what most of the country has switched over to using autoclaves for, which are steam sterilizing the waste to neutralize the biological problem without creating a chemical problem by burning it. There are other forms of this. Chemclave is one of them. Pathological waste like body parts can be neutralized and made safe with the other process, alkaline hydrolysis. Pharmaceutical waste, there are alternatives for that as well, ones that have been even used on chemical weapons to break those chemical bonds apart and make safer chemicals. Chemotherapeutic and hazardous waste is most likely appropriate to go into the same process or might need to go to a hazardous waste landfill. And radioactive waste, there are low-level so-called radioactive waste landfills where that could be appropriate. I see there's a hand raised. Mark, do you want to jump in right now if it's specific to what we're going over? Mark,
Can you hear me?
you're
I
on
was going to
mute.
say, if you can hold your questions, we'll have some participation at the end. So
Okay,
Mike,
so hold,
Mark, we're going to pass over for the moment, okay? Go
okay,
back
so
to
hold
you.
on your question. Feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll review them when we take off the screen share. So this is going back a ways, but in the crux of that time when so many medical waste incinerators were being closed, hundreds and even thousands of them, the group Healthcare Without Harm, which now includes hospitals and other medical professionals as a whole international network, they put out a report on non-incineration medical waste treatment technologies. So this has been known for a long time. This is what most of the industry switched to, and it's not in demand to be burning medical waste. It's only because Covanta has this profit motive that they're seeing. Now, when they claimed to us, they actually said all states require medical waste to be burned, except for a handful, and they specifically listed the ones that you see here. And so I intuitively thought that that was not true. And we researched it and looked at every single state's code, what the requirements are, and found that 0 states require all medical waste to be burned. There are just a handful that require tiny subsets of medical waste to be burned, like pathological or chemotherapeutic waste, which are about 1% or less of the medical waste stream. In Connecticut, you're one of the states that says chemotherapeutic waste must be burned, which I'm sure is being shipped out of state because there's nowhere else that would be doing that in the region. And Vermont is one that requires pathological waste to be burned. Rhode Island does, but it gives an opportunity to opt out of that if approved by the state environmental agency. So we looked at some of the cost issues. I've been pointing out that this is basically a moneymaker for Covanta. And some of these numbers are a few years old, so I apologize. Usually they climb up a bit each year with the contracts based on inflation and certain scales for cost of increase or inflation increases. So it was about $87 per ton a few years ago for regular trash that they burn. In Oregon, where they have a facility doing the same type of thing, burning trash primarily, but medical waste on the side, it's about $550 a ton that they get for receiving medical waste. And I confirmed with a friend who works in a hospital in the region that that is in the ballpark of what it would cost on this side of the country as well. So we're looking at the idea that Covanta, if by switching out 8% of their waste for medical waste, could be bringing in another 9 to $10 million a year by doing this, and that's really what's driving their their pursuits here. So if we look at the chemicals that come out, I just updated this with the latest EPA data, which unfortunately is a few years old. It comes out every third year, and so we have to wait 2 more years to get 2023. But 2020 data is out, and you can see the amounts of emissions that these are in tons. Sorry, these are in pounds of the chemicals that are coming out and what the health effects are caused by them. And some of these, like I didn't put global warming emissions, but carbon dioxide is in much, much bigger numbers even. And so there are a lot of different health effects caused already by what they're currently doing, which could be made worse in some cases by switching some of their waste stream to medical waste. And the most dangerous chemical is dioxins, which I mentioned earlier is the most toxic chemical known to science. It comes when you do things like burn PVC plastics, which have chlorine in them and are used widely in a lot of medical products. They cause so many different types of health problems. I couldn't list all of them, or you wouldn't be able to read the print on the slide. But according to EPA's own databases, the main type of dioxin, the one that everything is scaled to, the 2378 TCDD is what they call it, is literally 140,000 times more toxic than mercury. And there's no safe dose of dioxins or of mercury. Most of that dioxin you get from eating meat and dairy products because it comes out of the stack, and you get it not just from breathing, but you get it because it climbs up the food chain very quickly. And you get high exposures to breastfeeding infants, to anyone eating meat or dairy products. This is actually from an EPA report in the 90s that they never finalized because it's probably too dangerous for the industry for this information to come out. But you can see that almost every source that you get exposed to these extremely toxic chemicals that largely come from incinerators, as they documented, is a meat or dairy product. It hates water, so water ingestion is considered negligible. Now, the impacts of living around an incinerator like this, whether it's burning trash or medical waste, is largely in the form of cancers. In the studies that have found impacts, which are hard to find, there are a lot of studies, and some of them can't find things because people move around, pollutants move around. So Covanta likes to point to the studies that didn't find any connection and say, look, the science says there's no connection. But there are other studies that have found that, and some studies that they misrepresent when they talk about them. And the main trends we found in those studies is that cancers in general, and specifically the ones listed here, are elevated in communities around trash incinerators. So are respiratory diseases, cardiovascular, and urinary diseases. Okay, thank you for the confirmation, whoever said that. So is medical waste really worse than trash to burn? Well, Covanta admits that medical waste has more plastic than trash in general, and there are a lot of chemicals in plastic that either are toxic already or create toxic chemicals when burned, like especially the PVC, polyvinyl chloride plastics. But there are also still, in some cases, mercury in medical products. Mercury is a metal. You can't destroy it by burning it. So it goes in, it's going to come out. Same thing with PFAS. That can be changed, but PFAS is what they use in firefighting foam. It's also the Teflon chemical that makes your pans non-stick, and it's in all sorts of products, including things that are in medical products. And so these types of chemicals can come out surviving incineration and be emitted into the community as the same type of PFAS forever chemical, as they call it, or it can be turned into dioxin-like chemicals or acid gases, which are not fun to be exposed to either. And it also risks there being radioactive pollution. Now, Covanta says, and in their permit, we're not allowed to take radioactive waste. We won't be taking that. And that's true. They're not allowed to. However, most waste facilities, incinerators and landfills have, if they have radiation detection systems, not all of them do, but if they do, they usually get tripped regularly by adult diapers, because people who get cancer treatments with radiation in their bodies are excreting that. And where you have people using adult diapers, ends up in the waste stream. goes to a waste facility, trips the alarms for radioactive exposure. You also have radiation exit signs and things like that that still hit the waste stream, but medical waste increases the chance that this will happen. There's a medical waste chemclave, not an incinerator, but a different alternative in Berks County, Pennsylvania, which I once toured. And there was a time when they had a plutonium pacemaker that was ground up by their equipment, which is intended to grind things up and then sterilize them. And instead of making sure to take that off to a radioactive waste landfill, the state allowed them to throw it in a dumpster and just wait a little while and then send it to an area landfill. If that can happen, the same things can either slip through if they don't get stopped and caught, or we can have a state agency like the one in Pennsylvania, or in Connecticut, it would be DEEP, saying something like this, which I thought was quite inappropriate, to say radioactive waste can be thrown into a municipal waste facility like Covanta's trash incinerator if you just wait some number of weeks, which is not enough to completely neutralize it. Now, Covanta has made some comments in recent years about what they would do if they got this medical waste permit. They were quoted in the paper even saying that the company is agreeable to installing additional monitoring equipment, but not any special filtration or anything to actually reduce pollution, because they believe they can keep all emissions within permissible levels. We also know that they lied to us directly. In 2022, there was at least the second time they told us that they will be adding continuous emissions monitors for mercury if they build this, and yet the permits they sought and the draft that was recently released by DEEP do not require that to be done. And there are other Covanta facilities that, not many, but some who have monitored continuously for that pollutant. And that's about to be happening in Oregon, but they're not requiring it, even though they promised the community that would happen. Now, this chart here is from a comparison that that one of the folks as a guest here, Carol Johnston, in Oregon, put together. And it's a very good demonstration of how, when you exploit a federal loophole like they're doing, you can get away with polluting people a lot more than should be allowed. So there are certain standards for new medical waste incinerators. This would be a facility that is newly burning medical waste, but there's a federal loophole that says if you burn medical waste up to a certain amount in an existing trash incinerator, you get to be held to the weaker requirements for an old trash incinerator, not even the requirements for a new trash incinerator or an old medical waste incinerator, but the requirements for a new medical waste incinerator are stricter. And every dot on every value on here that is highlighted is one at the Covanta facility in Oregon that burns medical waste that would be in violation of the standards for new medical waste incinerators if they were held to that standard. Only because there's a federal loophole are they allowed to get away with having these higher amounts of pollution come out than would normally be allowed if they were building a separate facility to burn medical waste. So I want to walk through what I call the smokestack story. This is a story that every community hears that has anything with a smokestack. And you're going to hear a lot of this. So it's important to understand how to debunk it. I have the emperor wears no clothes here because there's a lot of that going on. So what you hear from regulators sometimes, especially from companies like Covanta, now called Reworld, so get used to their new name, but they say, don't worry, we have continuous emissions monitors on our stacks, and we know what's coming out of our smokestack at all times. And the state that information is going to the state environmental agency. So DEEP has that information, and they're a rigorous enforcer. And so if we go over the limit, they'll fine us very heavily. And staying within the limits mean that it's healthy and safe. I'm sure a number of you have heard some versions of this already. So I'm going to walk you through why that is not accurate. First of all, they're not always within permit limits. They routinely go over permit limits and are fined. Sometimes they go over permit limits and don't even get any fines. But when they do get fines, the fines are not enough to deter behavior. And there are plenty of examples I can point to when even what's considered a big fine by an agency ends up being peanuts for the company, and they end up continuing to have the same violations year after year and don't actually do anything to change what's causing those violations. They also cannot meet modern limits, at least for the nitrogen oxides or NOx that triggers asthma attacks. If there were even the plant they have right now, without even burning medical waste, if you were to build that today and operate it under the current standards, it would be illegal to do what they're currently doing. It's like taking a 1970s car that cannot meet current emissions limits and driving it around and not being held to any kind of modern testing for that. So emissions limits are a lot stricter for new facilities. They're a lot stricter in Europe and other countries. And EPA is supposed to update their standards every 5 years, but had to be sued a few years ago by environmental groups for being 16 years out of date. And by the time these new standards come into effect, which will be around 2028 or 9, it'll be 23 years since they last updated the standards for what Covanta is already doing. And most shockingly to a lot of people, permit limits are not based on health and safety. They're technology-based standards. I've had state regulators in multiple states admit this, sometimes on video. They are not scaled to health effects. They're just based on what the technology can do. And one of the ways that we know this is that if you have, for example, a 200 ton per day trash incinerator, they'll be allowed to put out a certain amount of pollution. But if you have yours, which is over 600 tons per day, they can put out 3 times more pollution because the permit limits in their permit are concentration based. They're parts per million or nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. Everything is per something. So bigger gets to be dirtier. And it doesn't matter if they're dirtier because they're bigger or they're having 5 other polluting facilities nearby, which some of that is true in your area. They don't look at that when they give out these permits. So it's not like there's a safe level that they can't cross and they scale permits to that. That's not how it works. Covanta has also been caught rigging stack tests and continuous monitoring data. The time that there was most notorious for them tampering with their continuous monitors was actually in Connecticut at their other plant. I believe it's in Preston. And the Attorney General fined them for tampering with their equipment to make it look like their emissions are lower than they actually are. I also know from folks who have worked for Covanta at different incinerators that they've tampered with their stack tests that happen once a year and burn things that burn cleaner during their test day. So we can't trust a lot of the stuff that comes out of them. The second to last point here is that there's no safe dose of a lot of the chemicals we're talking about. We already mentioned that for mercury and dioxins. This is true for lead, radiation, particulate matter, and a number of different pollutants. So it doesn't matter if they're within a permit limit. The amount that they're emitting is still enough that it could be harming people. And it probably is to some degree. And finally, the place where the emperor wears no clothes. If you really want to catch them, if you are on a tour or something and they say, we have continuous monitors, you ask them, well, for which pollutants? How many? Why aren't you doing continuous monitoring for any of the toxic pollutants? Because that's really what matters to a lot of people. And so the analogy I make here is if we regulate motorists, we regulate speeding for motorists the same way we regulate smokestacks for most chemicals. We will let people drive around all year with no speedometer. And once a year on the highway, there will be signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And the brother of the driver will be running the speed trap. That's literally what's going on with most chemicals from this incinerator and from most facilities. So here's a chart specific to Covanta Bristol, where you can see in green which chemicals they monitor on a continuous basis. In yellow, you'll see the chemicals that they monitor once a year with a self-test that they know is coming up. In orange, you'll see some that they have to monitor only one time every 5 years, and the red ones, not at all. All of these are chemicals that can and should be monitored continuously with modern technology, but they won't do that, and they'll fight against that like they're doing currently in Oregon because they don't want the truth to come out about how much more pollution they're putting out than they tell you when they only give you partial data. Now, when crunched the numbers, when I crunched the numbers from the biggest trash incinerator in the country, one of the ones near me in Chester, Pennsylvania, they have to use continuous monitors for hydrochloric acid. None of the ones in Connecticut do that, but they do that in Pennsylvania, thank goodness. And that one plant, I had data from both types of monitoring, from continuous and from the once a year stack test. And I found that the continuous monitoring data show the emissions are actually 62% higher than what the once a year test shows. You're only getting the once a year test. So there's a good chance that that pollutant is actually coming out at a much higher rate. With dioxins, there are studies out of Europe showing between 30 and 1,300 times higher emissions when using continuous sampling technology versus the once a year test that they use. And for that most toxic chemical known to science to be that underestimated is pretty shocking and really says that we need to be requiring this at the local or state level for these facilities. So how do we do that? Getting down to the point why I'm sure you're all here. What can we do about it? Well, there are different levels of ways of getting involved. There are things that the city of Bristol can do and that other local governments could do. There are things that the state can do, and there's some things that federal or other angles can do. So let's just walk through that for a minute, and we'll give some fodder to the discussion here. So we've approached the city of Bristol over the past few years and tried to get them to be willing to pass a local clean air law, like ones that are developed in other states and are successfully used in some cases against proposed and even existing facilities. They have basically passed on that. The mayor has become a mouthpiece for Covanta in recent news coverage, repeating their talking points. And the ordinance committee has basically sat on this for well over a year or two. Gave it to their corporation counsel, which did not even bother to pick up the phone and call me when we approached them with this, but went and looked for other examples around the state, found stuff that didn't make any sense, and ended up doing nothing. The city of Bristol still has the power, though, that they could do something if people push them hard enough. They could take action and make a difference here. There's also a regional body. It's called BRRFOC, and I'm not remembering that acronym, but it's I think it's Bristol Resource Recovery Facility something. And that's the name of the incinerator. They could like to call it resource recovery. It's actually resource destruction, but they take all our good words away and slap them on their incinerators. So there are 14 towns that send the waste to that incinerator, and they're in that consortium. That might be what the C is. And they could be organized, those towns, to develop zero waste plans, to minimize their waste, and to even better, stop using incinerators altogether, even though that would mean shipping waste to a landfill out of state, because there are no trash landfills in Connecticut anymore. That would still be more responsible regardless of the travel distance. The transportation component is very small compared to the facilities themselves. We've documented this. So it'll be much more responsible to send it to an out-of-state landfill if need be, and then reduce the waste as much as possible to minimize the need for that, than to keep burning. And if the towns were educated on that and pressured to do that, that could help take the waste away from this. Now, the health district in the area, I know they've been hearing a lot from residents who have been impacted by the noise from Covanta in the past year, which has been pretty horrible from what I understand. And folks there can probably speak to this much better than I can, but I understand they have not been terribly responsive. They were investigating it supposedly, but as far as any kind of Department of Health or health district, it's extremely rare that they use their powers to go after industrial air polluting facilities like this. They usually defer to agencies like DEEP and end up not doing anything. So I think of all your options here, 1 and 2 are your better ones at the local level. Now at the state level, you can give comments on the permit. Comments in writing are due by this Sunday. I have a link in a couple slides from now that you'll see where to look that up. So that's one thing people can do, but it's an exercise. We go through this in part because it's got the possibility of slowing them down and making them have to answer some questions. Maybe they'll change some little tweaks in the permit. There will be a public hearing because enough of you and others have signed on and said, we want a public hearing on this permit. So we're going to be talking to Deep in about a week about when that permit hearing would be. Hopefully we'll get it after Labor Day by some time and give people more opportunity to give written comments if we can get that deadline extended. But even after all of that, agencies will rubber stamp these permits. Don't have any illusions about it. I see this happen all over the country by every agency in this kind of context. That's what they do. They rubber stamp these permits. You can then have a lot of bake sales and hire lawyers to appeal those permits, which will buy you some time, often not lead to victory unless the company just gives up out of frustration or costing them too much money and too much time. But that is basically a stalling tactic for the most part. Sometimes you win, but for the most part, it's very expensive and difficult to go down. You can complain a lot to the agency and make them enforce things more and slap a few more fines on the facility, but that's not going to ultimately stop the medical waste burning or get them shut down. That just is unrealistic to expect. Now, the fifth option is one of the better ones. It's not easy. None of these are easy, but it's one of the easier, more likely ones. When medical waste incineration was proposed in Rhode Island, they actually got a statewide law passed that banned medical waste incineration essentially in the entire state. So that's one thing that a few other states have done. Rhode Island had already banned trash incineration, so has Delaware. So that's one thing that could be done. Okay, I heard that.
Sorry. Exits now. If you have items to check out, please bring them to the circulation desk at this time. The library is closing in 15 minutes. Thank you.
And the presentation is closing in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
We're almost
The
done.
audio works now.
So the federal loophole can also be closed by the state. If you get your state legislators introducing a bill to say, if you're going to start burning medical waste in the state, you have to follow the federal regulations for new medical waste incinerators. Seems totally reasonable. Just close that loophole. That could be done at the state level. And there's no way Covanta is going to install the expensive equipment it takes to do that. They'll just try at other plants, but they're not going to do that. So that's one way that could be successful. And there are other angles as well, like the state mandate for renewable energy to have a certain percentage come from renewable energy. Well, they shouldn't be counting burning trash as renewable energy. And that's a lot of subsidy money that goes from your electric bills to this industry that doesn't need to. And there are angles there. Now, I'm not even going to get your hopes up at the federal level. And I'll just be blunt and honest. I'm sorry if some of you don't like the politics of this part, but if Trump gets in, there's no hope for anything good happening at EPA. If whoever the Democrat is gets in, there's a tiny shred of hope. I've managed to get small incremental changes at EPA on incineration issues in the past few years under the Biden administration. I'm not hopeful for major change from them, but we can at least talk to them and pressure them and get some tiny tweaks. But it's not necessarily enough. So that's basically the scope of the difference on this type of issue, depending on the administration. I would also heavily discourage trying to go after litigation. It does not work like it does in Aaron Brockovich movies. There's not a good hope for class action suits or things that look good on TV to just sue because you don't like something, because you actually have to find something illegal about it. And most of what we're talking about is legal, and that's the problem. So we need to change the rules, not fight within their existing framework if we want to be able to win. And finally, one option that we can talk about is not one of the foolproof ones because they can always find other places. But if we can organize hospitals in the area and other generators of medical waste to commit to not burning their medical waste, that would frustrate them a bit and could be an angle that those, especially with connections to medical establishments, could engage in. Now, let me just hit the last couple of slides here so we can take off the screen share. On Wednesday, shameless plug here, but I'm doing a presentation for the whole country on why incineration is a false solution. So if you want more details about this specific industry and what the problems are with it, you'll get a lot more information out of that presentation. That's at 2 p.m. It's about 90 minutes. And you can go to ejnet.org/no-burn to get a shortcut link to the registration for that. It's on Zoom. And Sunday, as I mentioned, is the deadline for the comments on these permits. I made a shortcut link to that as well. So if you go to ejnet.org/Bristol permits, it'll jump you to the much longer URL on the deep website that has copies at the very bottom of the permits. There are 2 air permits there. They're the same. It's just burner 1 and burner 2. So look at either one of those and then the waste permit and any comments you have. If you can get them in by August 4th, that'll make sure that they're considered. So leave it there. Feel free to snap a picture of this if you want a contact info for me and for Jody. And I'll take off the screen share in a minute.